Is it simple to be a Marxist in philosophy? The following text contains the main arguments with which Louis Althusser accompanied his submission, at the University of Picardy, of certain of his earlier writings to the first for the degree of Doctorate d'État. The dialectical form of exposition is only correct when it knows its limits. Marx, a contribution to the critique of political economy. I think that I shall neither surprise nor upset anyone when I confess that I wrote none of these texts, the little Montesquieu, the articles in For Marx, the 2 chapters in Reading Capital, with a view to presenting them as a university thesis. It is, however, true that 26 years ago, in 1949-50, I did place before M. Hippolyte and M. Jankelevich a project for a grande thèse, as it used to be called, on politics and philosophy in the 18th century in France, with a petite thèse on Jean-Jacques Rousseau's second discourse. And I never really abandoned this project, as my essay on Montesquieu shows. Why do I mention this point? Because it concerns the texts placed before you. I was already a communist, and I was therefore trying to be a Marxist as well. That is, I was trying, to the best of my ability, to understand what Marxism means. Thus I intended this work on philosophy and politics in the 18th century as a necessary propedeutic to an understanding of Marx's thought. In fact, I was already beginning to practice philosophy in a certain way, a way which I have never abandoned. First of all, I was beginning to make use of the 18th century authors as a theoretical detour, a process which seems to me indispensable not only to the understanding of a philosophy but to its very existence. A philosophy does not make its appearance in the world as Minerva appeared to the society of gods and men. It exists only in so far as it occupies a position, and it occupies this position only in so far as it has conquered it in the thick of an already occupied world. It therefore exists only in so far as this conflict has made it something distinct, and this distinctive character can be won and imposed only in an indirect way, by a detour involving ceaseless study of other, existing positions. This detour is the form of the conflict which determines what side of philosophy takes in the battle and on the Kampfplatz, Kant, the battlefield which is philosophy. Because if the philosophy of philosophers is this perpetual war, to which Kant wanted to put an end by introducing the everlasting peace of his own philosophy, then no philosophy can exist within this theoretical relation of force except in so far as it marks itself off from its opponents, and lays siege to that part of the positions which they have had to occupy in order to guarantee their power over the enemy whose impress they bear. If, as Hobbes says, speaking perhaps to empty benches, and with reference as much to philosophy as to the society of men, war is a generalized state, and leaves nowhere in the world for a shelter, and if it produces its own condition as its own result, which means that every war is essentially preventive, it is possible to understand that the war of philosophies, in which systems come into conflict, presupposes the preventive stroke of positions against one another, and thus the necessary use by a philosophy of a detour via other philosophies in order to define and defend its own positions. If philosophy is, in the last instance, class struggle at the level of theory, as I have recently argued, then this struggle takes the form, proper to philosophy, of theoretical demarcation, detour and production of a distinctive position. To prove it, I need only refer, aside from the whole of philosophical history, to Marx himself, who was able to define himself only by reference to Hegel and by marking himself off from Hegel. And I think that, from afar, I have followed his example, by allowing myself to refer back to Spinoza in order to understand why Marx had to refer back to Hegel. Of course, this conception of philosophy as struggle, and, in the last instance, as class struggle in theory, implied a reversal of the traditional relation between philosophy and politics. So I went to work on a study of political philosophers and ordinary philosophers, from Machiavelli to Hegel, via Hobbes, Spinoza, Locke, Montesquieu, Rousseau and Kant. I claimed that it was necessary to get rid of the suspect division between philosophy and politics, which at one and the same time treats the political figures as inferior, that is, as non-philosophers or Sunday afternoon philosophers, and also implies that the political positions of philosophers must be sought exclusively in the texts in which they talk explicitly about politics. On the one hand, I was of the opinion that every political thinker, even if he says almost nothing about philosophy, like Machiavelli, can nevertheless be considered a philosopher in a strong sense. On the other hand, I held that every philosopher, even if he says almost nothing about politics, like Descartes, can nevertheless be considered a political thinker in a strong sense, because the politics of philosophers, that is, the politics which make philosophies what they are something quite different from the political ideas of their authors. For if philosophy is in the last instance class struggle at the level of theory, the politics which constitute philosophy, like the philosophy which supports the thought of political thinkers, cannot be identified with such and such an episode of the political struggle, nor even with the political inclinations of the authors. The politics which constitute philosophy bear on and revolve around a quite different question, that of the ideological hegemony of the ruling class, whether it is a question of organizing it, strengthening it, defending it or fighting against it. Here I am using formulae which I was not earlier in a position to put forward. But if I may say so, I was little by little discovering, as I challenged some accepted ideas, something resembling what I later called a new practice of philosophy, and having discovered the need for this new practice, I immediately started, for better or worse, to put it into practice. With the result, in any case, that it did later provide me with a special way of approaching Marx. If I seem to abandon this 18th century theoretical propedeutic, which in fact continued to inspire me, it was certainly not exclusively for personal reasons. What are called circumstances, those which I mention in the preface to For Marx, what after the 20th Congress of the CPSU was baptized by the name, without a concept, of the personality called, together with the rightist interpretations which then engulfed Marxism, celebrating or exploiting liberation or the hope of its coming in philosophies of man, of his freedom, of his designs, of transcendence, etc. These circumstances obliged me to throw myself into the battle. Keeping everything in proportion, you might say that like the young Marx, writing for the Rheinische Zeitung, who was forced to give an opinion on some practical questions, the theft of wood or the Prussian censorship, I too was soon forced, on pain of being misunderstood on account of my silence, to give an opinion on some burning questions of Marxist theory. The occasion for me to do so was accidental. That is, it happened that in 1960 I had to write a simple review, for the journal La Pensée, of an international collection of articles on the young Marx. This review became a counterattack, which did not simply take the accepted theses to task but attacked them from the flank. Thus I displaced the ground of the debate and to this end proposed a certain number of theses which since that time I have continued to argue, to work on and then to rectify. The reason I recall these circumstances is that I want to make a second remark about the polemical or, to put it bluntly, the political character of my philosophical essays. Those essays which are now placed before you had to declare openly that struggle is at the heart of every philosophy. Of course, what I have just said should make it clear that they are not made up of politics in the raw, since they are philosophical, nor are they simply polemical, a war of words, since they come out of a reasoned argument, and because the whole meaning of the effort is to put forward and defend the simple idea that a Marxist cannot fight, in what he writes or in what he does, without thinking out the struggle, without thinking out the conditions, the mechanisms and the stakes of the battle in which he is engaged and which engages him. These texts are thus explicit interventions in a definite conjuncture, political interventions in the existing world of Marxist philosophy, directed at one and the same time against dogmatism and the rightist critique of dogmatism, and also philosophical interventions in politics, against economism and its humanist appendix. But since they appealed to the history of the labor movement and to Marx, they could not be reduced to a simple commentary on the conjuncture. And I want to say this, whatever might be thought about its weaknesses and its limits, this philosophical intervention was the work of a member of the Communist Party, acting, even if I was at first isolated, even if I was not always listened to, even if I was then and still am criticized for what I said, within the labor movement and for it. Thus the work of a militant trying to take politics seriously in order to think out its conditions, limits and effects within theory itself, trying in consequence to define the line and forms of intervention. It cannot be denied that such an initiative involved great efforts and risks. And since I am talking about risks, I may be allowed to talk about one of them, leaving the others undiscussed, the one which concerns the theoretical position of my essays. Here it is. In the debate in which I became involved, I chose, with respect to certain politically and theoretically strategic points, to defend radical theses. These, literally stated, looked paradoxical and even theoretically provocative. 2 or 3 examples. To illustrate this choice, I argued and wrote that theory is a practice, and proposed the category of theoretical practice, a scandalous proposal in some people's eyes. Now this thesis, like every thesis, has to be considered in terms of its effect in drawing a demarcation line, that is, in defining a position of opposition. Its first effect was, in opposition to all forms of pragmatism, to justify the thesis of the relative autonomy of theory and thus the right of Marxist theory not to be treated as a slave to tactical political decisions, but to be allowed to develop, in alliance with political and other practices, without betraying its own needs. But at the same time this thesis had another effect, in opposition to the idealism of pure theory, of stamping theory with the materialism of practice. Another radical formulation, the internal character of the criteria of validation of theoretical practice. I was able to cite Lenin, who himself put forward this provocative thesis, among so many others. Marxist theory is all-powerful because it is true cubed. It is not because it is verified by its successes and failures that it is true, but because it is true that it is. verifiable by its successes and failures. But I brought in other arguments, that mathematics does not require the application of its theorems in physics and chemistry in order to prove it. That the experimental sciences do not require the technical application of their results in order to prove them. For demonstration and proof are the product of definite and specific material and theoretical apparatuses and procedures, internal to each science. There again it is the relative autonomy of theory which was at stake, not this time in opposition to theoretical idealism but in opposition to the pragmatic and empiricist lack of discrimination which made it impossible to distinguish practices from one another, like the cows in the Hegelian night. One last example, I argued in the thesis of Marxist theoretical anti-humanism. A precise thesis, but one whose precise meaning some people did not want to understand, and which roused against me all the world's bourgeois and social-democratic ideology, even within the international labor movement. Why did I take up such radical positions? I shall not shelter behind the argument of manifest ignorance, which can still be useful, but at the proper time. I want first of all to defend the principle of taking up these radical positions, because obviously they were met with cries of dogmatism, speculation, scorn for practice, for the concrete, for man, etc. This indignation was not without a certain piquancy. For my part, since I was not unaware of the relation which I mentioned above between philosophy and politics, I remembered Machiavelli, whose rule of method, rarely stated but always practiced, was that one must think in extremes, which means within a position from which one states borderline theses, or, to make the thought possible, one occupies the place of the impossible. What does Machiavelli do? In order to change something in his country's history, therefore in the minds of the readers whom he wants to provoke into thought and so into volition, Machiavelli explains, off stage as it were, that one must rely on one's own strength, that is, in fact, not rely on anything. Neither on an existing state nor on an existing prince, but on the non-existent impossibility, a new prince in a new principality? I found an echo of and a basis for this argument in Lenin. He, of course, a few years after What Is to Be Done, in response to certain criticisms which had been made of his formulae, replied in the form of the theory of the bending of the stick. When a stick is bent in the wrong direction, said Lenin, it is necessary, if you want to put matters right, that is, if you want to straighten it and keep it straight, to grasp it and bend it durably in the opposite direction. This simple formula seems to me to contain a whole theory of the effectiveness of speaking the truth, a theory deeply rooted in Marxist practice. Contrary to the whole rationalist tradition, which requires only a straight, true idea in order to correct a bent, false idea, Marxism considers that ideas have a historical existence only in so far as they are taken up and incorporated in the materiality of social relations. Behind the relations between simple ideas there thus stand relations of force, which place certain ideas in power, those which can be schematically called the ruling ideology, and hold other ideas in submission, which can be called the oppressed ideology, until the relation of force is changed. It follows that if you want to change historically existing ideas, even in the apparently abstract domain called philosophy, you cannot content yourself with simply preaching the naked truth, and waiting for its anatomical obviousness to enlighten minds, as our 18th-century ancestors used to say, you are forced, since You want to force a change in ideas, to recognize the force which is keeping them bent, by applying a counter-force capable of destroying this power and bending the stick in the opposite direction so as to put the ideas right. All this outlines the logic of a social process whose scope is obviously wider than any written text. But in a written text like what is to be done? The only form which this relation of forces can take is its presence, its recognition and its anticipation in certain radical formulae, which cause the relation of force between the new ideas and the dominant ideas to be felt in the very statement of the theses themselves. If I might, in my own modest way, allow myself to be inspired and empowered by these examples, I would say, yes, I did consciously confront and deal with the relation between ideas as a relation of force, and yes, I did consciously think in extremes about some points which I considered important and bend the stick in the opposite direction. Not for the pleasure of provocation, but to alert my readers to the existence of this relation of forces, to provoke them in this connection and to produce definite effects, not in function of some belief in the omnipotence of theory, for which I have been reproached by certain headmasters of the school of philosophy, but on the contrary in the materialist knowledge of the weakness of theory left to itself, that is, in the consciousness of the conditions of force which theory must recognize and to which it must defer if it is to have a chance of transforming itself into a real power. As a proof of what I have been saying, I would be happy, when the opportunity offers itself, to argue the point that this relation of force, counterbending and bending, this extremism in the formulation of theses, belongs quite properly to philosophy, and that even if they did not admit as much, as Lenin did in passing and from behind the shelter of a common maxim, the great philosophers always practiced it, whether they hid this fact behind an idealist disclaimer or brought it out into the full light of day in their treatment of the scandals of materialism. It remains true that in bending the stick in the opposite direction, you run a risk of bending it too little, or too much, the risk which every philosopher takes. Because in this situation, in which social forces and interests are at stake but can never be untangled with absolute certainty, there is no court of final appeal. If you intervene too abruptly, you run the risk of not immediately finding the mark. If you bend the stick too little or too much, you run the risk of finding yourself being pulled back into error. This, as you perhaps know, is what I publicly admitted to have happened to some extent in my own case, when I recognized in 1967 and explained more recently in the Elements of Self-Criticism that my writings of 1965, which have been laid before you, were impaired by a theoreticist tendency and just a little compromised by a flirt with structuralist terminology. But to be able to explain these failings I needed the perspective of time, not just a 10-year interval but the experience of the effects caused by my writings, of further work and of self-criticism. It has been written, you need to understand. I would add, especially to understand what you yourself have written. Before discussing the detailed argument of my essays, a word about their very general objective. This objective can be made out from the titles of my books, For Marx, Reading Capital. For these titles are slogans. I think that I can speak here for figures of my generation, who have lived through Nazism and Fascism, the Popular Front, the Spanish War, the War and the Resistance, and the Stalin period. Caught up in the great class struggles of contemporary history, we had engaged ourselves in the struggles of the labor movement and wanted to become Marxists. Now it was not easy to be a Marxist and to find one's feet within Marxist theory, even after the 20th Congress, since the dogmatism of the preceding period lived on, now in conjunction with its counterpoint, all that Marxist philosophical twaddle about man. And since this twaddle was based on the letter of the works of the young Marx, it was necessary to return to Marx in order to throw a little light on ideas clouded over by the trials of history. I do not want to lay stress on the political importance of this operation. It did, however, have something original about it, for which I have never been forgiven, in that it criticized dogmatism not from the right-wing positions of humanist ideology but from the left-wing positions of theoretical anti-humanism, anti-empiricism and anti-economism. I was not alone in the operation, as I later found out. Others, not only Della Volpe in Italy but also certain young Soviet thinkers whose writings have not been widely published, had also, in their own manner, set out on the same path. We were attempting to give back to Marxist theory, which had been treated by dogmatism and by Marxist humanism as the first available ideology, something of its status as a theory, a revolutionary theory. Marx had expressed the hope, in the preface to Capital, for a reader who is willing to think for himself. In order to try to understand what Marx had thought, the very least we had to do was to return to Marx and think for ourselves about what he had thought. Thus, in opposition to the subversion to which Marx's thought had been subjected, it seemed to me indispensable to lay stress on one simple idea, the unprecedented and revolutionary character of this thought. Unprecedented, because Marx had, in a work of conceptual elaboration which begins with the German ideology and culminates in Capital, founded what we might call, as a first approximation, the science of history. Revolutionary, because this scientific discovery which armed the proletariat in its struggle caused a complete upset in philosophy, not only by causing philosophy to revise its categories in order to bring them into line with the new science and its effects, but also and above all by giving philosophy the means, in the form of an understanding of its real relation to the class struggle, of taking responsibility for and transforming its own practice. It is this innovation, this radical difference between Marx and his predecessors, that I wanted not only to bring out but also to clarify and if possible to explain, because I considered it to be politically and theoretically vital for the labor movement and its allies, and still do consider it vital for this difference to be grasped. To this end I had to establish myself at the level of the new philosophy, produced by Marx in the course of his scientific revolution, and in a movement of thought close to Spinoza and sanctioned by Marx to try to grasp this difference on the basis of the newly acquired truth. But to the same end I had to grasp the philosophy capable of grasping the difference, that is, I had to obtain a clear view of Marx's own philosophy. Now everyone knows that the mature Marx left us nothing in this line except the extraordinary 1857 introduction to a contribution to the critique of political economy and the intention, which he never realized, of writing a dozen pages on the dialectic. No doubt Marx's philosophy is, as Lenin said, contained in Capital, but in a practical state, just as it is also contained in the great struggles of the labor movement. I decided that it had to be extracted, and basing myself on the available fragments and examples, I tried to give it a form resembling its concept. That is why the question of Marxist philosophy naturally occupied the center of my attention. I did not make it the center of the world. I did not raise philosophy to the level of command, but I had to make this philosophical detour in order to grapple with the radical character of Marx's work. This conviction has always been with me. I would now formulate it differently from In for Marx and Reading Capital, but I consider that I made no mistake in locating philosophy as the place from which Marx can be understood, because that is where his position is summed up. The last instance, I now suggest to you that my essays should be approached by three rough paths which travel across them and intersect. I will first take the path of the last instance. We know that Marx and Engels argued the thesis of the determination by the economy in the last instance. This little phrase, which seems like nothing at all, in fact upsets the whole ruling conception of society and of history. Not enough attention has been paid to the figure or metaphor in which Marx presents his conception of a society in the preface to the 1859 contribution. This figure is that of a typography, that is, of a spatial apparatus which assigns positions in space to given realities. The Marxist typography presents society in terms of the metaphor of an edifice whose upper floors rest, as the logic of an edifice would have it, on its foundation. The foundation is in German die Basis or die Struktur, which is traditionally translated as base or more often infrastructure. It is the economy, the unity of the productive forces and relations of production under the dominance of the relations of production. From the base of the ground floor rise the upper floor or floors of the Überbau, in translation the legal, political and ideological superstructure. A simple image, it will be said, representing realities. Agreed, but it also distinguished these realities, which is very important, for example by placing positive law, which Hegel includes within civil society, in the category of the superstructure, and thus distinguishing something very different from simple realities, their efficacy and its dialectic. When Marx says that the base or infrastructure is determinant in the last instance, he implies that what it determines is the superstructure. For example, the specific economic form in which unpaid surplus labor is pumped out of the direct producers determines the relationship of domination and servitude, as this grows directly out of production itself and reacts back on it in turn as a determinant. To the first, but the determination of which Marx is thinking here is determination only in the last instance. As Engels wrote, in a letter to Bloch, according to the materialist conception of history, the ultimately determining element in history is the production and reproduction of real life. More than this neither Marx nor I have ever asserted. Hence if somebody twists this into saying that the economic element is the only determining one, he transforms that proposition into a meaningless, abstract, senseless phrase. To the first and the determination of the typography, the last instance really is the last instance. If it is the last one, as in the legal image which it invokes, court of the last instance, that is because there are others, those which figure in the legal, political and ideological superstructure. The mention of the last instance in determination thus plays a double role. It divides Marx sharply off from all mechanistic explanations, and opens up within determination the functioning of different instances, the functioning of a real difference in which the dialectic is inscribed. The typography thus signifies that the determination in the last instance by the economic base can be grasped only within a differentiated, therefore complex and articulated whole, the Gliederung, in which the determination in the last instance fixes the real difference of the other instances, their relative autonomy and their own mode of reacting on the base itself. Before drawing the consequences, I would like to underline the decisive theoretical importance of this category of the last instance, too often considered as a philosophical approximation or popularization. To argue for the determination in the last instance by the economy is to mark oneself off from all idealist philosophies of history. It is to adopt a materialist position. But to talk about the determination by the economy in the last instance is to mark oneself off from every mechanistic conception of determinism and to adopt a dialectical position. However, when you are working in Hegel's shadow, you must be on your guard against the idealist temptations involved in the dialectic. And Marx is on his guard, because when he inscribes the dialectic within the functioning of the instance of a typography, he effectively protects himself from the illusion of a dialectic capable of producing its own material content in the spontaneous movement of its self-development. In submitting the dialectic to the constraints of the typography, Marx is submitting it to the real conditions of its operation. He is protecting it from speculative folly. He is forcing it into a materialist mold, forcing it to recognize that its own figures are prescribed by the material character of its own conditions. I agree that this inscription and this prescription are not in themselves sufficient to provide us with the figures of the materialist dialectic in person, but they do save us from at least one temptation, that of seeking these figures ready-made in Hegel. In this manner we come back to the themes developed in my essays, whose object was to differentiate between Marx and Hegel. I have stated elsewhere what debt Marx owed to Hegel, and also why he was constantly forced to make the detour via Hegel in order to find his own way forward. To the first squared, yes, Marx was close to Hegel, but above all for reasons which are not mentioned, for reasons which go back further than the dialectic, for reasons which relate to Hegel's critical position in respect to the theoretical presuppositions of classical bourgeois philosophy, from Descartes to Kant. To sum it up in a few words, Marx was close to Hegel in his insistence on rejecting every philosophy of the origin and of the subject, whether rationalist, empiricist or transcendental. In his critique of the cogito, of the sensualist empiricist subject and of the transcendental subject, thus in his critique of the idea of a theory of knowledge, Marx was close to Hegel in his critique of the legal subject and of the social contract, in his critique of the moral subject, in short of every philosophical ideology of the subject, which whatever the variation involved gave classical bourgeois philosophy the means of guaranteeing its ideas, practices and goals by not simply reproducing but philosophically elaborating the notions of the dominant legal ideology. And if you consider the grouping of these critical themes, you have to admit that Marx was close to Hegel just in respect to those features which Hegel had openly borrowed from Spinoza, because all this can be found in the Ethics and the Tractatus Theologico-Politicus. These deep-rooted affinities are normally passed over in pious silence. They nevertheless constitute, from Epicurus to Spinoza and Hegel, the premises of Marx's materialism. They are hardly ever mentioned, for the simple reason that Marx himself did not mention them, and so the whole of the Marx-Hegel relationship is made to hang on the dialectic, because this Marx did talk about, as if he would not be the first to agree that you must never judge someone on the basis of his own self-conscious image but on the basis of the whole process which, behind this consciousness, produces it. I hope I shall be excused for laying so much stress on this point, but it is the key to the solution of very many problems, real or imaginary, concerning Marx's relation to Hegel, and within Marx concerning the relation of the dialectic to materialism. In fact, I believe that the question of the Marxist dialectic cannot be properly posed unless the dialectic is subjected to the primacy of materialism, and a study is made of what forms this dialectic must take in order to be the dialectic of this materialism. From this point of view, it is easy to understand how the idea of the dialectic could have imposed itself on a philosophy like that of Hegel, not only because the dramatic turmoil of the French Revolution and its after-effects provided the hard lesson, but also because the dialectic was the only means of thinking within a philosophy which had very good reasons for originally refusing, even if it later transformed and reintroduced them, the use and guarantee of the categories of origin and subject. Of course, Hegel did not apply himself to the search for the dialectic only after rejecting origin and subject. In a single movement he created the dialectic which he needed to differentiate himself from the classical philosophies, and, to force it to serve his ends, he mystified the dialectic, to use Marx's words, to the first cube. But that does not mean that the Hegelian mystification itself is not witness to a relation constant since the time of Epicurus, and perhaps before him, between materialism, which can play its role only by drawing a demarcation line between itself and every philosophy of the origin, whether of being, of the subject or of meaning, and the dialectic. To make the matter clearer in a few words, when you reject the radical origin of things, whatever the figure used, you need to create quite different categories from the classical ones in order to get a grasp on those notions, essence, cause or liberty, whose authority is drawn from this origin. When you reject the category of origin as a philosophical issuing bank, you have to refuse its currency too, and put other categories into circulation, those of the dialectic. That is in outline the profound relation linking the premises of the materialism to be found in Epicurus, Spinoza and Hegel, which governs not only everything about the dialectic but also the dialectic itself. It is this which seems to me important, much more than the conclusions without premises which are the only judgments made by Marx on Hegel, and where he raises only and for its own sake the question of the dialectic. He does this, of course, in order to recognize in Hegel the merit of having, I quote, been the first to express the general movement of the dialectic, which is correct and certainly a rather reserved statement, but also in order to argue, this time without any reservations, that Hegel had mystified it, and that Marx's own dialectic was not only not that of Hegel, but its exact opposite. But we also know that according to Marx it was enough, in order to demystify the Hegelian dialectic, to invert it. I have argued enough in the past about the fact that this idea of inversion did not do the job and was only a metaphor for a real materialist transformation of the figures of the dialectic, to the first, about which Marx promised us a dozen pages which he never wrote. This silence was surely not accidental. It was doubtless a consequence of the need to trace a line back from the conclusions to the materialist premises of the dialectic, and on the basis of these premises to think out, in the strong sense, the new categories which they imply and which can be found in operation in Capital and in Lenin's writings, but do not always or do not yet clearly bear their name. I became involved in this problem when I started to look for the difference, in their very proximity, between Marx and Hegel. It is quite obvious that if Marx borrowed from Hegel the word and the idea of the dialectic, he nevertheless could not possibly have accepted this doubly mystified dialectic, mystified not only in the idealist attempt to produce its own material content, but also and above all in the figures which realized the miracle of its self-incarnation, negation and the negation of the negation, or Aufhellung. Because if the Hegelian dialectic rejects every origin, which is what is said at the beginning of the logic, where being is immediately identified with nothingness, it projects this into the end of a telos, which in return creates, within its own process, its own origin and its own subject. There is no assignable origin in Hegel, but that is because the whole process, which is fulfilled in the final totality, is indefinitely, in all the moments which anticipate its end, its own origin. There is no subject in Hegel, but that is because the becoming subject of substance, as an accomplished process of the negation, is the subject of the process itself. If Marx took over the idea of the dialectic from Hegel, he not only inverted it in order to rid it of the pretension or fantasy of self-production, but also had to transform its figures so that they should cease to produce the implied effects. Lenin made the point again and again during the years 1918-23 that if socialism does not succeed in transforming petty commodity production, then as long as it is allowed to exist, petty commodity production will continue to give rise to capitalism. One might say, in the same manner, as long as Marxism does not succeed in transforming the figures of the dialectic mystified by Hegel, these figures will continue to give rise to Hegelian, mystified effects. Now this transformation was not to be found in my head, nor only in the future, but out in the open in the texts of Marx and Lenin and the practice of the proletarian class struggle. I was therefore simply trying to formulate conceptually what already existed in the practical state. That, to approach the matter from this direction, is why I claimed that Marx did not have the same idea of the nature of a social formation as Hegel, and I believed that I could demonstrate this difference by saying that Hegel thought of society as a totality, while Marx thought of it as a complex whole, structured in dominance. If I may be allowed to be a little provocative, it seems to me that we can leave to Hegel the category of totality, and claim for Marx the category of the whole. It might be said that this is a verbal quibble, but I do not think this is entirely true. If I preferred to reserve for Marx the category of the whole rather than that of the totality, it is because within the totality a double temptation is always present, that of considering it as a pervasive essence which exhaustively embraces all of its manifestations, and, what amounts to the same thing, that of discovering in it, as in a circle or a sphere, a metaphor which makes us think of Hegel once again, a center which would be its essence. On this point I believed that I had found an important difference between Marx and Hegel. For Hegel, society, like history, is made up of circles within circles, of spheres within spheres. Dominating his whole conception is the idea of the expressive totality in which all the elements are total parts, each expressing the internal unity of the totality which is only ever, in all its complexity, the objectification alienation of a simple principle. And in fact, when you read the Recht's philosophy, you find that Hegel is deploying, in the dialectic of the objective spirit which produces them, the spheres of abstract law, of Moralität and Sittlichkeit, so that each produces the other through the negation of the negation so as to find their truth in the state. There are many differences between them, but since their relation is always one of truth, these differences are always affirmed only to be denied and transcended in other differences, and this is possible because in each difference there is already present the in itself of a future for itself. And when you read the introduction to the philosophy of history, you find the same process, one might even say the same procedure. Each moment of the development of the idea exists in its states, which realize a simple principle, the beauty of individuality for ancient Greece, the legal spirit for Rome, etc. And borrowing from Montesquieu the idea that in a historical totality all concrete determinations, whether economic, political, moral or even military, express one single principle, Hegel conceives history in terms of the category of the expressive totality. For Marx, the differences are real, and they are not only differences in spheres of activity, practices and objects, they are differences in efficacy. The last instance operates here in such a way that it explodes the peaceful fiction of the circle or the sphere. It is not an accident that Marx abandons the metaphor of the circle for that of the edifice. A circle is closed, and the corresponding notion of totality presupposes that one can grasp all the phenomena, exhaustively, and then reassemble them within the simple unity of its center. Marx, on the other hand, presents us with an edifice, a foundation, and one or two upper floors, exactly how many is not stated. Nor does he say that everything must fall into these categories, that everything is either infrastructure or superstructure. You could even argue for the idea, essential to capital, that the Marxist theory of societies and of history implies a whole theory of their incidental costs and their failures. Marx says only that you must distinguish, that the distinctions are real, irreducible, that in the order of determination the share of the base and that of the superstructure are unequal, and that this inequality or unevenness in dominance is constitutive of the unity of the whole, which therefore can no longer be the expressive unity of a simple principle all of whose elements would be the phenomena. That is why I talked about a whole, to make it clear that in the Marxist conception of a social formation everything holds together, that the independence of an element is only ever the form of its dependence, and that the interplay of the differences is regulated by the unity of a determination in the last instance. But that is why I did not talk about a totality, because the Marxist whole is complex and uneven, and stamped with this unevenness by the determination in the last instance. It is this interplay, this unevenness, which allow us to understand that something real can happen in a social formation and that through the political class struggle it is possible to get a hold on real history. I made the point in passing. No politics have ever been seen in the world which were inspired by Hegel. For where can you get a hold on the circle when you are caught in the circle? Formally, the Marxist typography gives an answer when it says, this is what is determinant in the last instance, the economy, therefore the economic class struggle, extended into the political class struggle for the seizure of state power, and this is how the class struggle in the base is linked, or is not linked, to the class struggle in the superstructure. But that is not all. In pointing this out, the Marxist typography refers any questioner to his place in the historical process. This is the place which you occupy, and this is where you must move to in order to change things. Archimedes wanted only a single fixed point in order to lift up the world. The Marxist typography names the place where you must fight because that is where the fight will take place for the transformation of the world. But this place is no longer a point, nor is it fixed, it is an articulated system of positions governed by the determination in the last instance. All this remains formal, no one will deny it, in the preface to the contribution to which I have alluded. But the Communist Manifesto called things by their names, and capital repeated them. Capital is full of examples of the topographical figure. It is through the use of this figure that theoretical determination can become practical decision, because it arranges things in such a way that the workers, to whom Marx was talking, can seize them. The concept which is grasped, begriff, becomes in Marx the theoretical practical apparatus of a typography, a means of practically grasping the world. It is easy to see that in this new whole, the dialectic at work is not at all Hegelian. I tried to show this in connection with the question of contradiction, by pointing out that if you take seriously the nature of the Marxist whole and its unevenness, you must come to the conclusion that this unevenness is necessarily reflected in the form of the overdetermination or of the underdetermination of contradiction. Of course, it is not a question of treating overdetermination or underdetermination in terms of the addition or subtraction of a quantum of determination, a quantum added or subtracted from a pre-existing contradiction, that is, one leading a de jure existence somewhere. Overdetermination or underdetermination are not exceptions in respect to a pure contradiction. Just as Marx says that man can be alone only within society, just as Marx says that the existence of simple economic categories is an exceptional product of history, in the same way a contradiction in the pure state can exist only as a determinate product of the impure contradiction. The effect of this thesis is quite simply to change the reference points from which we look at contradiction. And, in particular, it warns us against the idea of what I have called simple contradiction, or more exactly contradiction in the logical sense of the term, whose terms are two equal entities each simply bearing one of the contrary signs plus or, A or not A. If I might now go a little further than I did in my first essays, but in the same direction, I should say that contradiction, as you find it in capital, presents the surprising characteristic of being uneven, of bringing contrary terms into operation which you cannot obtain just by giving the second a sign obtained by negating that of the first. This is because they are caught up in a relation of unevenness which continuously reproduces its conditions of existence just on account of this contradiction. I am talking, for example, about the contradiction within which the capitalist mode of production exists and which, tendentially, condemns it to death, the contradiction of the capitalist relation of production, the contradiction which divides classes into classes, in which two quite unequal classes confront each other, the capitalist class and the working class. Because the working class is not the opposite of the capitalist class, it is not the capitalist class negated, deprived of its capital and its powers, and the capitalist class is not the working class plus something else, namely riches and power. They do not share the same history, they do not share the same world, they do not lead the same class struggle, yet they do come into confrontation. And this certainly is a contradiction, since the relation of confrontation reproduces the conditions of confrontation instead of transcending them in a beautiful Hegelian exaltation and reconciliation. I think that if you keep in sight this special characteristic of Marxist contradiction, that it is uneven, you will come up with some interesting conclusions, not only about capital but also about the question of the struggle of the working class, of the sometimes dramatic contradictions of the labor movement, and of the contradictions of socialism. For if you want to understand this unevenness, you will have to follow Marx and Engels in taking seriously the conditions which make the contradiction uneven, that is, the material and structural conditions of what I have called the structured whole in dominance, and here you will get a glimpse into the theoretical foundations of the Leninist thesis of uneven development. Because in Marx all development is uneven, And here again it is not a question of additions to or subtractions from a so-called even development, but of an essential characteristic. Every development is uneven, because it is contradiction which drives development, and because contradiction is uneven. That is why, alluding to the discourse on the origin of inequality by Rousseau, who was the principal theoretician of alienation before Hegel, I once added as a subtitle to my article on the materialist dialectic the phrase, on the unevenness of origins, signifying by the plural, origins, that there is no origin in the philosophical sense of the term, and that every beginning is marked with unevenness. I have only sketched out a few themes, simply to indicate the critical importance of the thesis of the last instance for understanding Marx. And it is of course true that every interpretation of Marxist theory involves not only theoretical stakes but also political and historical. These theses on the last instance, on the structured whole in dominance, on the unevenness of contradiction, had an immediate principal objective, which governed the way in which they were expressed, that of recognizing and indicating the place and the role of theory in the Marxist labor movement, not just by taking note of Lenin's famous slogan "Without revolutionary theory there can be no revolutionary movement," to the first, but by going into detail in order to free theory from confusions, mystifications and manipulations. But beyond this primary objective, my theses had other, more important aims, bearing on the temptations faced by the labor movement, the temptation of a messianic or critical idealism of the dialectic, which has haunted intellectuals in revolt from the time of the young Lukács and even of the old and new young Hegelians. The temptation of what I called the poor man's Hegelianism, the evolutionism which has always, in the labor movement, taken the form of economism. In both cases, the dialectic functions in the old manner of pre-Marxist philosophy as a philosophical guarantee of the coming of revolution and of socialism. In both cases, materialism is either juggled away, in the case of the first hypothesis, or reduced to the mechanical and abstract materiality of the productive forces, in the case of the second hypothesis. In all cases the practice of this dialectic runs up against the implacable test of the facts. The revolution did not take place in 19th century Britain, nor in early 20th century Germany. It did not take place in the advanced countries at all, but elsewhere, in Russia, then later in China and Cuba, etc. How can we understand this displacement of the principal contradiction of imperialism onto the weakest link, and correlatively how can we understand the stagnation in the class struggle in those countries where it appeared to be triumphant, without the Leninist category of uneven development, which refers us back to the unevenness of contradiction and its over and under determination? I am deliberately stressing under determination, because while certain people easily accepted a simple supplement to determination, they could not accept the idea of under determination, that is, of a threshold of determination which, if it is not crossed, causes revolutions to miscarry, revolutionary movements to stagnate or disappear, and imperialism to rot while still developing, etc. If Marxism is capable of registering these facts, but not capable of understanding them, if it cannot grasp, in the strong sense, the obvious truth that the revolutions which we know are either premature or miscarried, but from within a theory which dispenses with the normative notions of prematurity and of miscarriage, that is, with the normative standpoint, then it is clear that something is wrong on the side of the dialectic, and that it remains caught up in a certain idea which has not yet definitively settled accounts with Hegel. That is why I think that in order to see more clearly what makes Marx different, one must put into its proper perspective the immediate formulation in which he expressed his relation to the Hegelian dialectic. To do so one must first consider how Marx's materialism is expressed, because the question of the dialectic depends on this. And there is a rather good way of dealing with this problem, which I have just tried to follow, that which uses the category of determination in the last instance. On the process of knowledge I now want, much more briefly, to take another path across my essays in order to look at another group of theses developed there on the question of knowledge. I cannot hide the fact that in this matter I depended heavily on Spinoza. To the first I said a moment ago that Marx was close to Hegel in his critique of the idea of a theory of knowledge, but this Hegelian critique is already present in Spinoza. What does Spinoza in fact mean when he writes, in a famous phrase, Habemus enim idem veram? To the first, that we have a true idea? No, the weight of the phrase lies on the enim. It is in fact because and only because we have a true idea that we can produce others, according to its norm. And it is in fact because and only because we have a true idea that we can know that it is true, because it is index sui. Where does this true idea come from? That is quite a different question. But it is a fact that we do have it, habemus, and whatever it may be that produces this result, it governs everything that can be said about it and derived from it. Thus Spinoza in advance makes every theory of knowledge, which reasons about the justification of knowledge, dependent on the fact of the knowledge which we already possess. And so every question of the origin, subject and justification of knowledge, which lie at the root of all theories of knowledge, is rejected. But that does not prevent Spinoza from talking about knowledge, not in order to understand its origin, subject and justification, but in order to determine the process and its moments, the famous three levels, which moreover appear very strange when you look at them close up, because the first is properly the lived world, and the last is specially suited to grasping the singular essence, or what Hegel would in his language call the concrete universal of the Jewish people, which is heretically treated in the theologico-political treatise. I am sorry if some people consider, apparently out of theoretical opportunism, that I thus fall into a heresy, but I would say that Marx, not only the Marx of the 1857 introduction, which in fact opposes Hegel through Spinoza, but the Marx of Capital, together with Lenin, is in fact on close terms with Spinoza's positions. For while they too reject every theory of the origin, subject and justification of knowledge, they too talk about knowledge. And the fact that Lenin claims for Marxism the expression theory of knowledge to the first is not an embarrassment when you realize that he defines it as the dialectic. In fact, Marx and Lenin talk about knowledge in very general terms, to describe the general aspects of its process. One must be suspicious of those passages in which Marx states such generalities. There is at least one case, among others, with respect to which he did explain himself, that of production. To the first at one and the same time he outlines the general characteristics of production and yet argues that general production and, a fortiori, production in general do not exist, because only particular modes of production exist within concrete social formations. This is one way of saying that everything takes place within the concrete structure of particular processes, but that in order to be able to grasp what is happening you need the help of that minimum of non-existent generality without which it would be impossible to perceive and understand what does exist. Well, I think that the 1857 introduction is in this vein. I think that it introduces neither a theory of knowledge nor its surrogate, an epistemology. I think that it only expresses that minimum of generality without which it would be impossible to perceive and understand the concrete processes of knowledge. But just like the general concept of production, the general concept of knowledge is there only to disappear in the concrete analysis of concrete processes, in the complex history of the processes of knowledge. In the whole of this affair I based myself as closely as possible on Marx's 1857 introduction, and if I used it to produce some necessary effects of theoretical provocation, I think I did nevertheless remain faithful to it. I was directly and literally inspired by Marx, who several times uses the concept of the production of knowledge, to argue my central thesis, the idea of knowledge as production. I obviously also had in mind an echo of Spinozist production, and I drew on the double sense of a word which beckoned both to labor, practice, and to the display of truth. But essentially, and in order to provoke the reader, I held closely, I would even say mechanically, to the Marxist concept of production, which literally suggests a process and the application of tools to a raw material. I even outbid Marx by presenting a general concept of practice, which reproduced the concept of the labor process to be found in Capital. And, referring back to theoretical practice, I used and no doubt forced a little Marx's text in order to arrive at the distinction between the three generalities, squared, the first of which functioned as the theoretical raw material, the second as the instruments of theoretical labor, and the third as the concrete in thought or knowledge. I admit that Spinoza was involved in this affair too, because of his three levels of knowledge, and the central role of the second, scientific abstraction. What interested me above all else in Marx's text was his radical double opposition to empiricism and to Hegel. In opposition to empiricism, Marx argued that knowledge does not proceed from the concrete to the abstract but from the abstract to the concrete, and that all this takes place, I quote, in thought, while the real object, which gives rise to this whole process, exists outside thought. In opposition to Hegel, Marx argued that this movement from the abstract to the concrete was not a manner of producing reality but of coming to know it. And what fascinated me in all this argument was that one had to begin with the abstract. Now Marx wrote that knowledge is a product of thinking, of comprehension, a product of the assimilation and transformation, ein Produkt der Verarbeitung of perceptions and images into concepts, and also that it would seem to be the proper thing to start with the real and concrete elements, for example, to start in the sphere of economy with population. Closer consideration shows, however, that this is wrong. Population is an abstraction squared to the first. I concluded that perceptions and images, Anschauung und Vorstellung, were treated by Marx as abstractions, and I attributed to this abstraction the status of the concrete or of experience as you find it in Spinoza's first level of knowledge, that is, in my language, the status of the ideological. Of course I did not say that generalities too, working on generalities work only on ideological material, because they could also be working on abstractions which are already scientifically elaborated, or on both together. But there did remain this borderline case of a purely ideological raw material, a hypothesis which allowed me to introduce the science-ideology antithesis, and the epistemological break, which Spinoza, long before Bachelard, inserted between his first and second levels of knowledge. And thus I produced a certain number of ideological effects, which, as I have pointed out in my Elements of Self-Criticism, squared were not free of all theoreticism. But of course, since I suffered from what Rousseau called something like the weakness of believing in the power of consequences, I did not stop there, but drew an important distinction, that between the real object and the object of knowledge. Squared cubed, this distinction is contained in the very phrases in which Marx deals with the process of knowledge. As a materialist, he argues that knowledge is knowledge of a real object, Marx says, a real subject, which, I quote, remains, after as before, outside the intellect and independent of it. Squared? And a little later, in reference to the subject of investigation, society, he writes, I quote, that it must always be envisaged therefore as the precondition of comprehension. Marx therefore opposes, as a precondition of the whole process of knowledge of a real object, the existence of this real object outside thought. But this exteriority of the real object is affirmed at the same time as he affirms the specific character of the process of knowledge, which is the product of the assimilation and transformation of perceptions and images into concepts. And at the end of the process, the thought concrete, the thought totality, which is its result, presents itself as knowledge of the real concrete, of the real object. The distinction between the real object and the process of knowledge is indubitably present in Marx's text, as is the reference to the work of elaboration and the diversity of its moments, and the distinction between the thought concrete and the real object, of which it gives us knowledge. I used this text not in order to construct a theory of knowledge but in order to stir something within the world of the blindly obvious, into which a certain kind of Marxist philosophy retreats in order to protect itself from its enemies. I suggested that if all the knowledge which we possess really is knowledge of a real object which remains after as before independent of the intellect, there was perhaps some point in thinking about the interval separating this before from the after, an interval which is the process of knowledge itself, and in recognizing that this process, defined by the work of elaboration of successive forms, was inscribed precisely, from beginning to end, in a transformation which bears not on the real object squared, but only on its stand-ins. First of all on the perceptions and images, then on the concepts which come out of them. Thus I arrived at my thesis: if the process of knowledge does not transform the real object, but only transforms its perception into concepts and then into a thought concrete, and if all this process takes place, as Marx repeatedly points out, in thought, and not in the real object, this means that, with regard to the real object, in order to know it, thought operates on the transitional forms which designate the real object in the process of transformation in order finally to produce a concept of it, the thought concrete. I referred to the set of these forms, including the last one, produced by this operation in terms of the category object of knowledge. In the movement which causes the spontaneous perceptions and images to become the concept of the real object, each form does indeed relate to the real object, but without becoming confused with it. But neither can the thought concrete which is finally produced be confused with the real, and Marx attacks Hegel precisely for allowing this confusion to take place. Once again Spinoza came to mind, and the memory of his haunting words: the idea of a circle is not the circle, The concept of a dog does not bark. In short, you must not confuse the real thing and its concept. Squared. Of course, if this necessary distinction is not solidly supported, it may lead to nominalism, even to idealism. It is generally agreed that Spinoza fell into nominalism. But he did in any case take measures to protect himself from idealism, both in developing his theory of a substance with infinite attributes, and in arguing for the parallelism of the two attributes, extension and thought. Marx protects himself in another way, more securely, by the use of the thesis of the primacy of the real object over the object of knowledge, and by the primacy of this first thesis over the second, the distinction between the real object and the object of knowledge. Here you have that minimum of generality, that is, in the case in question, of materialist theses, which, by drawing a line between themselves and idealism, open up a free space for the investigation of the concrete processes of the production of knowledge. And finally, for whoever wants to make the comparison, this thesis of the distinction between real object and object of knowledge functions in a very similar manner to Lenin's distinction between absolute truth and relative truth, and to a very similar purpose. Lenin wrote, "You will say that this distinction between relative and absolute truth is indefinite. And I shall reply, it is sufficiently indefinite to prevent science from becoming a dogma in the bad sense of the term, from becoming dead, frozen, ossified. But at the same time it is sufficiently definite to enable us to draw a dividing line in the most emphatic and irrevocable manner between ourselves and fideism and agnosticism, between ourselves and philosophical idealism and the sophistry of the followers of Hume and Kant." Squared? Which means, to put it bluntly, our thesis is precise enough not to fall into idealism, precise enough to draw a line between itself and idealism, that is, correct enough in its generality to prevent the living freedom of science from being buried under its own results. The same is true, keeping everything in proportion, of my thesis on the difference between the real object and the object of knowledge. The stakes were considerable. It was a question of preventing the science produced by Marx from being treated as a dogma in the bad sense of the term. It was a question of bringing to life the prodigious work of criticism and elaboration carried out by Marx, without which he would never have been able, to put it in his way, which remains classical, to discover behind the appearance of things, and in diametrical opposition to this appearance, their unrecognized intimate relations. It was a question of getting people to understand and to appreciate the unprecedented break which Marx had to make with the accepted world of appearances, that is, with the overwhelmingly obvious truths of the dominant bourgeois ideology. And since we were ourselves involved in this matter, it was a question of turning this truth into a living and active truth for us, because we had to break with other obvious truths, sometimes couched in Marx's own vocabulary, whose meaning the dominant ideology or deviations in the labor movement had distorted. It was a question of recalling that if, as Lenin said, the living soul of Marxism is the concrete analysis of a concrete situation, squared, then knowledge of the concrete does not come at the beginning of the analysis, it comes at the end, and the analysis is possible only on the basis of Marx's concepts, and not on the basis of the immediate, obvious evidence of the concrete, which one cannot do without, but which cannot really be understood from the marks it bears on its face. Finally, and this was not the least important aspect, it was a question of recalling with Marx that knowledge of reality changes something in reality, because it adds to it precisely the fact that it is known, though everything makes it appear as if this addition cancelled itself out in its result. Since knowledge of reality belongs in advance to reality, since it is knowledge of nothing but reality, it adds something to it only on the paradoxical condition of adding nothing to it, squared, and once produced it reverts to it without need of sanction, and disappears in it. The process of knowledge adds to reality at each step its own knowledge of that reality, but at each step reality puts it in its pocket, because this knowledge is its own. The distinction between object of knowledge and real object presents the paradox that it is affirmed only to be annulled. But it is not a nullity, because in order to be annulled it must be constantly affirmed. That is normal. It is the infinite cycle of all knowledge, which adds something to reality, precisely, knowledge of reality, only to give it back, and the cycle is only a cycle, and therefore living, as long as it reproduces itself, because only the production of new knowledge keeps old knowledge alive. These things happen more or less as in Marx's text, which says, living labor must add new value to materials in order that the value of the dead labor contained in the means of production should be preserved and transferred to the product, since, I quote, it is by the simple addition of a certain quantity of labor, that the original values of the means of production are preserved in the product. Cubed. What is at stake with regard to these theses? Let us take Marxist science and suppose that political conditions are such that no one works on it anymore, no one is adding any new knowledge. Then the old knowledge that reality has pocketed is there, within it, in the form of enormous and dead obvious facts, like machines without workers, no longer even machines but things. We can no longer in this case be sure, as Lenin puts it, of preventing science from becoming a dogma in the bad sense of the term, from becoming dead, frozen, ossified. Which is another way of saying that Marxism itself risks repeating truths which are no longer any more than the names of things, when the world is demanding new knowledge, about imperialism and the state and ideologies and socialism and the labor movement itself. It is a way of recalling Lenin's astonishing remark that Marx only laid the foundation stones of a theory which we must at all costs develop in every direction. Cubed to the first, it is a way of saying, Marxist theory can fall behind history, and even behind itself, if ever it believes that it has arrived. Marx and theoretical humanism. I now want, very briefly, to follow one last path across my essays, in order to test out another provocative thesis, that of Marx's theoretical anti-humanism. I would say that just for the pleasure of watching the ideological fireworks with which it was met, I would have had to invent this thesis if I had not already put it forward. Cubed squared. It is a serious thesis, as long as it is seriously read, and above all as long as serious attention is paid to one of the two words which make it up, and not the diabolical one, but the word theoretical. I said and repeated that the concept or category of man did not play a theoretical role in Marx. But unfortunately this term theoretical was ignored by those who did not want to understand it. Let us try to understand it. And, to that end, let me first say a word about Feuerbach, some of whose texts I translated. No one will deny that Feuerbach's philosophy is openly a theoretical humanism. Feuerbach says, every new philosophy announces itself under a new name. The philosophy of modern times, my philosophy, he says, announces itself under the name man. Cubed and in fact man, the human essence, is the central principle of the whole of Feuerbach's philosophy. It is not that Feuerbach is not interested in nature, because he does talk about the sun and the planets, and also about plants, dragonflies and dogs, and even about elephants in order to point out that they have no religion. But he is first of all preparing his ground, if I may put it that way, when he talks about nature, when he calmly tells us that each species has its own world, which is only the manifestation of its essence. This world is made up of objects, and among them there exists one object par excellence in which the essence of the species is accomplished and perfected, its essential object. Thus each planet has the sun as an essential object, which is also the essential object of the planet, etc. Now that the ground is prepared, we can turn our attention to man. He is the center of his world as he is at the center of the horizon that bounds it, of his world. There is nothing in his life which is not his, or rather nothing which is not him, because all the objects of his world are his objects only in so far as they are the realization and projection of his essence. The objects of his perception are only his manner of perceiving them, the objects of his thought are only his manner of thinking them, and the objects of his feelings are only his manner of feeling them. All his objects are essential in so far as what they give him is only ever his own essence. Man is always in man, man never leaves the sphere of man, because, in a simple little phrase which the young Marx took over from Feuerbach, and which provoked some scholarly discussion among the participants in last summer's Hegel Congress in Moscow, the world is the world of man and man is the world of man. Cubed. The sun and the stars, the dragonflies, perception, intelligence and passion are only so many transitions on the road to the decisive truths. Man's specific characteristic, unlike the stars and the animals, is to have his own species, the essence of his species, his whole generic essence as the object. And in an object which owes nothing to nature or religion. By the mechanism of objectification and inversion, the generic essence of man is given to man, unrecognizable in person, in the form of an exterior object, of another world, in religion. In religion, man contemplates his own powers, his productive forces as powers of an absolute other before whom he trembles and kneels down to implore pity. And this is perfectly practical, because out of it came all the rituals of religious worship, even the objective existence of miracles, which really do take place in this imaginary world since they are only, in Feuerbach's words, and I quote, the realization of a desire, Wunscherfüllung. Cubed. The absolute object which is man thus comes up against the absolute in God, but does not realize that what he comes up against is himself. The whole of this philosophy, which does not limit itself to religion but also deals with art, ideology, philosophy, and in addition, a fact which is too little known, with politics, society, and even history, thus rests on the identity of essence between subject and object, and this identity is explained by the power of man's essence to project itself in the self-realization which constitutes its objects, and in the alienation which separates object from subject, makes the object exterior to the subject, reifies it, and inverts the essential relation, since scandalously enough the subject finds itself dominated by itself, in the form of an object, God or the state, etc., which is, however, nothing but itself. It must not be forgotten that this discourse, of which I can only sketch the premises here, had a certain grandeur, since it called for the inversion produced by religious or political alienation to be itself inverted. In other words, it called for an inversion of the imaginary domination of the attributes of the human subject. It called on man finally to claim back possession of his essence, alienated in his domination by God and the state. It called on man finally, no longer in the imaginary world of religion, in the heaven of the state, or in the alienated abstraction of Hegelian philosophy, but on the earth, here and now, in real society, to realize his true human essence, which is the human community, communism. Cubed man at the center of his world, in the philosophical sense of the term, the originating essence and the end of his world, that is what we can call a theoretical humanism in the strong sense. It will be agreed, I think, that Marx, having originally espoused Feuerbach's problematic of the generic essence of man and of alienation, later broke with him. And also that this break with Feuerbach's theoretical humanism was a radical event in the history of Marx's thought. But I would like to go further, for Feuerbach is a strange philosophical personality with this peculiarity, if I may be allowed the expression, of blowing the gaff. Feuerbach is a confessed theoretical humanist, but behind him stands a whole row of philosophical precursors who, while they were not so brave as to confess it so openly, were working on a philosophy of man, even if in a less transparent form. Far be it from me to denigrate this great humanist tradition, whose historical merit was to have struggled against feudalism, against the church, and against their ideologists, and to have given man a status and dignity. But far be it from us, I think, to deny the fact that this humanist ideology, which produced great works and great thinkers, is inseparably linked to the rising bourgeoisie whose aspirations it expressed, translating and transporting the demands of a commercial and capitalist economy sanctioned by a new system of law, the old Roman law revised as bourgeois commercial law. Man is a free subject. Free man is a subject of his actions and his thoughts, is first of all man free to possess, to sell and to buy, the subject of law. I will cut matters short and put forward the claim here that, with some untimely exceptions, the great tradition of classical philosophy has reproduced in the categories of its systems both the right of man to know, out of which it has made the subject of its theories of knowledge. From the cogito to the empiricist and the transcendental subject. And the right of man to act, out of which it has made the economic, moral and political subject. I believe, but obviously cannot prove it here, that I have the right to claim the following, in the form of the different subjects in which it is both divided up and disguised, the category of man, of the human essence, or of the human species, plays an essential theoretical role in the classical pre-Marxist philosophies. And when I talk about the theoretical role which a category plays, I mean that it is intimately bound up with the other categories, that it cannot be cut out of the set without altering the functioning of the whole. I think I can say that, with a few exceptions, the great classical philosophy represents, in implicit form, an indisputably humanist tradition. And if in his own way Feuerbach blows the gaff, if he puts the human essence squarely at the center of the whole thing, it is because he thinks he can escape from the constraint which caused the classical philosophies to hide man behind a division into several subjects. This division, let us say into two subjects, in order to simplify matters, which makes man a subject of knowledge and a subject of action, is a characteristic mark of classical philosophy and prevents it from coming out with Feuerbach's fantastic declaration. Feuerbach himself thinks he can overcome this division, For the plurality of subjects he substitutes the plurality of attributes in the human subject. And he thinks he can settle another politically important problem, the distinction between individual and species, in terms of sexuality, which suppresses the individual because it requires that there should always be at least two of them, which already makes a species. I think that it becomes obvious from the manner in which Feuerbach proceeds that even before him the main concern of philosophy was man. The difference was that man was divided up between several subjects, and between the individual and the species. It follows that Marxist theoretical anti-humanism is much more than a settling of accounts with Feuerbach. It is directed at one and the same time both against the existing philosophies of society and history and against the classical tradition of philosophy, and thus through them against the whole of bourgeois ideology. I would say that Marxist theoretical anti-humanism is above all a philosophical anti-humanism. If what I have just said has any truth in it, you have only to compare it with what I said earlier about Marx's affinities with Spinoza and Hegel in their opposition to philosophies of the origin and the subject to see the implications. And in fact, if you examine the texts which might be considered the authentic texts of Marxist philosophy, you do not find the category of man or any of its past or possible disguises. The materialist and dialectical theses which make up the whole of what little Marxist philosophy exists can give rise to all kinds of interpretations. But I do not see how they can allow any humanist interpretation. On the contrary, they are designed to exclude it, as one variety of idealism among others, and to invite us to think in a quite different manner. But we still have not finished, because we still have to understand the theoretical anti-humanism of historical materialism, that is, the elimination of the concept of man as a central concept by the Marxist theory of social formations and of history. Perhaps we ought first of all to deal with two objections. In fact, we certainly ought to try, because they come up again and again. The first concludes that any Marxist theory conceived in the above manner ends by despising men and paralyzing their revolutionary struggle. But capital is full of the sufferings of the exploited, from the period of primitive accumulation to that of triumphant capitalism, and it is written for the purpose of helping to free them from class servitude. This, however, does not prevent Marx, but on the contrary obliges him to abstract from concrete individuals and to treat them theoretically as simple supports of relations, and this in the same work, Capital, which analyses the mechanisms of their exploitation. Cubed. The second objection opposes to Marx's theoretical anti-humanism the existence of humanist ideologies which, even if they do in general serve the hegemony of the bourgeoisie, may also, in certain circumstances and within certain social strata, and even in a religious form, express the revolt of the masses against exploitation and oppression. But this raises no difficulty as soon as you realize that Marxism recognizes the existence of ideologies and judges them in terms of the role they play in the class struggle. What is at stake here is something quite different, the theoretical pretensions of the humanist conception to explain society and history, starting out from the human essence, from the free human subject, the subject of needs, of labor, of desire, the subject of moral and political action. I maintain that Marx was able to found the science of history and to write Capital only because he broke with the theoretical pretensions of all such varieties of humanism. In opposition to the whole of bourgeois ideology, Marx declares, a society is not composed of individuals, Grundrisse, and My analytic method does not start from man but from the economically given period of society. Notes on Wagner's textbook. And against the humanist and Marxist socialists who had proclaimed in the Gotha program that labor is the source of all wealth and all culture, he argues, the bourgeois have very good grounds for falsely ascribing supernatural creative power to labor. Cubed. Can one imagine a more distinct break? The effects can be seen in capital. Marx shows that what in the last instance determines a social formation, and allows us to grasp it, is not any chimerical human essence or human nature, nor man, nor even men, but a relation, the production relation, which is inseparable from the base, the infrastructure. And, in opposition to all humanist idealism, Marx shows that this relation is not a relation between men, a relation between persons, nor an intersubjective or psychological or anthropological relation, but a double relation, a relation between groups of men concerning the relation between these groups of men and things. The means of production. It is one of the greatest possible theoretical mystifications you can imagine to think that social relations can be reduced to relations between men, or even between groups of men, because this is to suppose that social relations are relations which involve only men, whereas actually they also involve things. The means of production, derived from material nature. The production relation is, says Marx, a relation of distribution. It distributes men among classes at the same time and according as it attributes the means of production to a class. The classes are born out of the antagonism in this distribution, which is also an attribution. Naturally, human individuals are parties to this relation, therefore active, but first of all in so far as they are held within it. It is because they are parties to it, as to a freely agreed contract, that they are held within it, and it is because they are held within it that they are parties to it. It is very important to understand why Marx considers men in this case only as supports of a relation, or bearers of a function in the production process, determined by the production relation. It is not at all because he reduces men in their concrete life to simple bearers of functions. He considers them as such in this respect because the capitalist production relation reduces them to this simple function within the infrastructure, in production. That is, in exploitation. In effect, the man of production, considered as an agent of production, is only that for the capitalist mode of production. He is determined as a simple support of a relation, as a simple bearer of functions, completely anonymous and interchangeable, for if he is a worker he may be thrown into the street, and if he is a capitalist he may make a fortune or go bankrupt. In all cases he must submit to the law of a production relation, which is a relation of exploitation, therefore an antagonistic class relation. He must submit to the law of this relation and its effects. If you do not submit the individual concrete determinations of proletarians and capitalists, their liberty or their personality to a theoretical reduction, then you will understand nothing of the terrible practical reduction to which the capitalist production relation submits individuals, treating them only as bearers of economic functions and nothing else. But to treat individuals as simple bearers of economic functions has consequences for the individuals. It is not Marx the theoretician who treats them as such, but the capitalist production relation. To treat individuals as bearers of interchangeable functions is, within capitalist exploitation, which is the fundamental capitalist class struggle, to mark them irreparably in their flesh and blood, to reduce them to nothing but appendices of the machine, to cast their wives and children into the hell of the factory, to extend their working day to the maximum, to give them just enough to reproduce themselves, and to create that gigantic reserve army from which other anonymous bearers can be drawn in order to put pressure on those who are in employment, who are lucky enough to have work. But at the same time it is to create the conditions for an organization of struggle of the working class. For it is the development of the capitalist class struggle, that is, of capitalist exploitation, which itself creates these conditions. Marx continually insisted on the fact that it was the capitalist organization of production which forcibly taught the working class the lesson of class struggle, not only in concentrating masses of workers in the place of work, not only in mixing them together, but also and above all in imposing on them a terrible discipline of labor and daily life, all of which the workers suffer only to turn it back in common actions against their masters. But in order for all this to happen, the workers must be party to and held within other relations. The capitalist social formation, indeed, cannot be reduced to the capitalist production relation alone, therefore to its infrastructure. Class exploitation cannot continue, that is, reproduce the conditions of its existence, without the aid of the superstructure, without the legal, political and ideological relations, which in the last instance are determined by the production relation. Marx did not enter into this analysis, except in the form of a few brief remarks. But from everything he said we can conclude that these relations to treat concrete human individuals as bearers of relations, as supports of functions, to which men are parties only because they are held within them. Thus, legal relations abstract from the real man in order to treat him as a simple bearer of the legal relation, as a simple subject of law, capable of owning property, even if the only property which he possesses is that of his naked labor power. Thus two political relations abstract from the living man in order to treat him as a simple support of the political relation, as a free citizen, even if his vote only reinforces his servitude. And thus to the ideological relations abstract from the living man in order to treat him as a simple subject either subjected to or rebelling against the ruling ideas. Cubed but all these relations, each of which uses the real man as its support, nevertheless determine and brand men in their flesh and blood, just as the production relation does. And since the production relation is a relation of class struggle, it is the class struggle which in the last instance determines the superstructural relations, their contradiction, and the overdetermination with which they mark the infrastructure. And just as the capitalist class struggle creates, within production, the conditions of the workers' class struggle, so you can see that the legal, political and ideological relations can contribute to its organization and consciousness, through the very constraints which they impose. For the proletarian class struggle really did learn politics within the framework of bourgeois relations, and via the bourgeois class struggle itself. Everyone knows very well that the bourgeoisie was able to overthrow the old regime, its production relation and its state, only by engaging the popular masses in its struggle. And everyone knows that the bourgeoisie was able to defeat the great landowners only by enrolling the workers in its political battle, afterwards, of course, massacring them. Through its law and its ideology as well as through its bullets and its prisons, the bourgeoisie educated them in the political and ideological class struggle, among other ways by forcing them to understand that the proletarian class struggle had nothing to do with the bourgeois class struggle, and to shake off the yoke of its ideology. It is here that the last instance, and the contradictory effects which it produces within the edifice, intervenes to account for the dialectic of these paradoxical phenomena, which Marx grasps not with the help of the ridiculous concept of man, but with quite different concepts: production relation, class struggle, legal, political and ideological relations. Theoretically, the functioning of the last instance allows us to account for the difference and unevenness between the forms of the class struggle, from the economic struggle to the political and ideological struggle, and thus for the interplay existing between these struggles and for the contradictions existing in this struggle. Marx's theoretical anti-humanism, as it operates within historical materialism, thus means a refusal to root the explanation of social formations and their history in a concept of man with theoretical pretensions, that is, a concept of man as an originating subject, one in whom originate his needs, homo economicus, his thoughts, homo rationalis, and his acts and struggles, homo moralis, juridicus and politicus. For when you begin with man, you cannot avoid the idealist temptation of believing in the omnipotence of liberty or of creative labor, that is, you simply submit, in all freedom, to the omnipotence of the ruling bourgeois ideology, whose function is to mask and to impose, in the illusory shape of man's power of freedom, another power, much more real and much more powerful, that of capitalism. If Marx does not start with man, if he refuses to derive society and history theoretically from the concept of man, it is in order to break with this mystification which expresses only an ideological relation of force, based in the capitalist production relation. Marx therefore starts out from the structural cause producing this effect of bourgeois ideology which maintains the illusion that you should start with man. Marx starts with the given economic formation, and in the particular case of capital, with the capitalist production relation and the relations which it determines in the last instance in the superstructure, and each time he shows that these relations determine and brand men, and how they brand them in their concrete life, and how, through the system of class struggles, living men are determined by the system of these relations. In the 1857 introduction Marx said, "The concrete is a synthesis of many determinations." We might paraphrase him and say, men in the concrete sense are determined by a synthesis of the many determinations of the relations in which they are held and to which they are parties. If Marx does not start out from man, which is an empty idea, that is, one weighed down with bourgeois ideology, it is in order finally to reach living men. If he makes a detour via these relations of which living men are the bearers, it is in order finally to be able to grasp the laws which govern both their lives and their concrete struggles. We should note that at no time does this detour via relations estrange Marx from living men, because at each moment of the process of knowledge, that is, at each moment in his analysis, Marx shows how each relation, from the capitalist production relation, determinant in the last instance, to the legal political and ideological relations, brands men in their concrete life, which is governed by the forms and effects of the class struggle. Each of Marx's abstractions corresponds to the abstraction imposed on men by these relations, and this terribly concrete abstraction is what makes men into exploited workers or exploiting capitalists. We should also note that the final term of this process of thought, the thought concrete, to which it leads, is that synthesis of many determinations which defines concrete reality. Marx thus placed himself on class positions, and he had in view the mass phenomena of the class struggle. He wanted to aid the working class to understand the mechanisms of capitalist society and to discover the relations and laws within which it lives, in order to reinforce and orientate its struggle. He had no object other than the class struggle. His aim was to help the working class to make revolution and thus finally, under communism, to suppress the class struggle and classes. The only more or less serious objection which can be made to the thesis of Marxist theoretical anti-humanism is, I must be honest enough to admit it, related to those texts which, in capital, return to the theme of alienation. I say deliberately, the theme, because I do not think that the passages in which this theme is taken up have a theoretical significance. I am suggesting that alienation appears there not as a really considered concept but as a substitute for realities which had not yet been thought out sufficiently for Marx to be able to refer to them, the forms, still on the horizon, of organization and struggle of the working class. The theme of alienation in capital could thus be said to function as a substitute for a concept or concepts not yet formed, because the objective historical conditions had not yet produced their object. If this hypothesis is correct, it becomes possible to understand that the Commune, in answering Marx's expectations, rendered the theme of alienation superfluous, as did the whole of Lenin's political practice. In fact, alienation disappears from Marx's thought after the Commune, and never appears in Lenin's immense work. But this problem does not just concern Marxist theory. It also involves the historical forms of its fusion with the labor movement. This problem faces us openly today. We shall have to examine it. Still simple d'être Marxist and philosophy. La Pensée 183, October 1975. Translated by Graham Locke. 6. The transfer